On December 21st, 1866, near a remote army post called Fort Phil Kearny, a group of men walked into the winter hills. They were soldiers and a few civilian helpers. They carried rifles, and they hid their fear. By the end of that day, every one of them was gone. Not one returned to explain what happened from the inside. Only the snow and the hills kept the secret. This event became known by two names. Many Americans later called it the Fetterman Fight, after the officer who led the force. Many Lakota people called it the Battle of the 100 Slain, a name often translated as the Battle of 100 in the Hands. Two names, one day, one terrible outcome. At first, it did not feel like legend. It felt like another morning in a fort that lived on alert. Fort Phil Kearny was a rough wooden post, built fast on hard ground. Winter wind cut through its walls. The men inside were tired, far from home, and surrounded by hills that felt watched. Every rise in the land could hide riders. The fort sat beside the Bozeman Trail, a route used by travelers heading toward gold country. Too many newcomers, the trail looked like progress. To the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it looked like invasion. This land was not empty. It was hunting land. It was living land. It was tied to families and survival. That is why this time is remembered as part of Red Cloud's war. Red Cloud, a Lakota leader, wanted the trail and the forts removed. He did not want soldiers guarding the route as if it belonged to someone else. His goal was simple: stop the road, protect the homeland. Inside the fort, Colonel Henry Carrington had orders to hold the post. But daily life created a problem that never ended: wood. The fort needed wood for heat, cooking, and repairs. The main supply was in the hills at a place soldiers called Piney Island. To get it, men had to leave the fort, cut trees, load heavy logs, and haul them back by wagon, and almost every trip drew attack. The strikes did not always look like a single big battle. Often they were fast and sharp. Riders appeared on ridges, shots cracked, horses screamed. Then the attackers slipped away before the soldiers could catch them. The wood train slowed. The men grew angry. The fort felt helpless, even when it was armed. Over time, that anger turned into talk. Some soldiers said the fort was too cautious. They said the solution was to ride out hard and crush the attackers once and for all. This kind of belief is dangerous because it makes risk feel like courage. Captain William J. Fetterman was an officer with confidence and a reputation for action. He had seen fighting before. He believed bold moves could end the problem. Some men liked him because he sounded certain. Carrington did not see boldness as a cure. He counted the distance, the terrain, and the danger of being cut off. He knew the hills could hide large groups. He knew that outside the fort, the enemy chose the ground. On the morning of December 21st, trouble began the way it often did. Shots were heard near the wood train. Movement flashed at the edge of the trees. The alarm spread through the fort. Men grabbed weapons. Boots pounded frozen dirt. Orders rose over the wind. Carrington chose to send a relief force, a group meant to drive attackers away and bring the woodcutters home. He also gave a clear rule. The soldiers were not to cross a ridge called Lodge Trail Ridge. That ridge was more than a hill. It was a boundary. On one side, the fort could still support the men. On the other side, the land folded away, and the fort could not see or help out. Crossing that ridge meant stepping out of sight. The relief force moved out quickly. Fetterman was placed in command. The air burned the lungs. Snow hit holes in rocks. The men marched hard, because time matters when someone is under fire. As they reached higher ground, they saw riders ahead. Not a huge force, not an army in plain view, just a small group moving in a way that looked almost careless. They came close, then pulled back. They watched. They tempted two tired soldiers. It looked like a simple chance: catch them, punish them, and finally feel in control again. The riders began to retreat, as if scared. as if they did not want to fight, as if the soldiers were winning before the fight even started. Fetterman's men followed. They followed farther from the fort. They followed toward Lodge Trail Ridge with each step. The sounds of the fort grew smaller, and the sounds of the wind grew louder. The ridge rose in front of them like a final warning. Behind them was safety they could still reach. If they turned back now, ahead of them was a chase, a test, and the promise of victory. In the biography of this battle, this is the moment that decides everything. Not the moment of gunfire. The moment of choice. The men climbed, and on the far side of the ridge, the land waited. The ridge stood behind Fetterman's men like a closing door. The fort was now out of sight. The chase had pulled them into open winter ground, where the hills could hide anything. Back at Fort Phil Kearny, the fear did not leave when the soldiers left. It only changed shape. Inside the wooden walls, the fort felt like a small island in a frozen sea. The men who stayed behind watched the same ridges again and again until their eyes hurt. They listened for gunfire the way people listen for thunder. In a storm, sometimes the shots came close. Sometimes the sound came late, carried by the wind. Either way, the meaning was the same. Someone was in danger. Colonel Henry Carrington knew the fort could not survive without discipline. The men needed rules because panic could kill faster than bullets. He had built the fort, organized patrols, and tried to keep the wood trains moving. But he also knew the hard truth of the place. The fort was not strong because it was powerful. It was strong because it was stubborn. Carrington had a problem that never stopped. The land around the fort belonged to someone else in spirit, history, and need. The Lakota and their allies did not see the fort as a normal military post. They saw it as a lock placed on their road, their hunting, and their future. This was the heart of the conflict. Too many soldiers, the Bozeman Trail was just a line on a map. It was a path for wagons, miners, and mail. It was work, it was orders, it was a job that might end and send them home. To Red Cloud and his people, it was a cut that kept getting deeper. Red Cloud's war was not built on random anger. It was built on purpose. He wanted to make the trail too dangerous to use. He wanted to make the forts too costly to keep. If the road could be stopped, the pressure on the land could slow. And to do that, he needed more than bravery. He needed control. He needed timing, patience, and traps. A few miles from the fort, in the winter hills and tree lines, warriors watched the soldiers the way hunters watch prey. They learned the fort's habits. They learned how long it took men to form up. They learned how far the wagons traveled. They learned where the ground forced a slow turn, where a horse would stumble, where a rifle line would break. They also learned something important about the soldiers' emotions. The fort was full of men who felt trapped, men who felt embarrassed, men who wanted a win they could talk about. After weeks of wood train attacks, many soldiers believed they were being toyed with, and in a way, they were. The hit-and-run attacks were not only about taking lives or wagons, they were also about shaping the soldiers' thinking. They were about pushing them toward a mistake. Carrington tried to prevent that mistake. He gave orders that were clear. He warned his officers not to chase too far. He knew that when soldiers chase, they often stop thinking. But Carrington had another problem: pride within his own walls. Some officers believed Carrington was too careful. Some soldiers blamed him for every loss. When the men grew angry and tired, they did not blame the winter or distance. They blamed a man giving cautious orders. Captain William J. Fetterman stood in this storm of opinions like a match near dry. Wood Fetterman was not a coward. He was not lazy. He was trained and experienced. But he carried a dangerous kind of confidence. He believed bold action could change the balance. He believed he could defeat any force if he moved fast and struck hard. And in a place like Fort Phil Kearny, that kind of confidence could sound like hope. Many men wanted to follow him because he seemed sure. They were tired of guarding wagons and watching ridges. They wanted to chase and finish the problem. They wanted a moment that felt like victory, not survival. So when the wood train was attacked on December 21st, and Fetterman was sent out with a relief force, the energy of the fort moved with him. It was more than a mission. It was a test. It was a chance to prove something outside the fort. The decoy riders played their part with skill. They showed themselves just enough to be seen. They moved close enough to pull attention. They fired a few shots and then retreated, like men who feared being caught. They did not run wildly. They ran in control. This is what made the trap work. A panicked retreat looks messy. A planned retreat looks tempting. Fetterman's men followed them with rising speed. Snow snapped under boots. Horses blew steam into the cold. The small group ahead looked like it was almost within reach. Always, almost, always just one more push away. The soldiers could not see what waited beyond the slopes. The ground rolled like waves. A low place could hide hundreds. A clump of trees could hide a line of riders. A ridge could hide an entire force sitting still. The fort's rule about Lodge Trail. Ridge was supposed to stop this exact problem, but rules often lose strength. When emotions grow louder, Fetterman pressed forward. Some men might have hesitated. Some might have remembered Carrington's warning. But the chase had its own logic now. The more the riders pulled away, the more the soldiers wanted to close the gap. Behind them, the fort was blind. The walls could not help men it could not see. The soldiers were now a moving point in a wide land out at the fort. Carrington likely felt the pressure in his chest, even if he did not show it. He could not call the men back with a rope. He could only hope they would obey, and hope that help would arrive if things turned bad. But hope is not a plan. It is only what people hold when the plan has left their hands. Fetterman's force continued deeper into the hills. The decoy riders stayed ahead, pulling them toward a place chosen in advance. A place where the terrain could close around them. A place where warriors could rise from hidden points, fast and coordinated, in the Lakota memory. This battle would become the Battle of the 100 Slain, a name that carried weight and meaning. It marked a victory so complete that it became a story in itself. But the men walking forward did not know the name yet. They only knew the chase. They only knew the cold. They only knew the feeling that the day might finally go their way. Ahead, the decoy riders crested another rise and disappeared for a moment. Fetterman's men pushed after them, believing they were seconds from catching the enemy in the open. And then the ground ahead went quiet in a way that felt wrong. A silence too, sudden, a pause to perfect. Because in war, when the enemy becomes easy to find, it often means something else is ready to be seen. On the far side of the next slope, hidden eyes were watching and many hands were already in position. The trap was not closing, it had already closed. The winter hills held their breath as Fetterman's men moved forward. The small group of riders ahead had slipped over another rise, just out of view. For a few seconds, it felt like the chase might end, like the soldiers might finally catch the men who had been striking the wood. Trains for weeks, but the silence did not feel normal. The land on the far side of the slope was too quiet. No shouting, no running horses, no messy retreat, only open ground broken by low dips, scattered trees, and ridges that could hide more than a man's eyes could guess. Fetterman's force kept going anyway. There were about 81 men in all. Most were soldiers. A few were civilians connected to the fort's work. Some rode horses. Others moved on foot. Their rifles were cold in their hands. Their mouths were dry. Their hearts pushed hard against their ribs. They had crossed the line Carrington had warned them about. They were beyond Lodge Trail Ridge now. The fort was behind them, and it could not see what was happening in front of them. That mattered more than many of them understood in the open. A fort is not just a building. A fort is safety. It is cover. It is extra guns. It is a place to fall back. When a unit moves too far from it, that unit becomes alone, and alone is the condition where small mistakes become fatal. Fetterman did not seem to think of it that way. He had the energy of a man who believed this day could change the story. He had the focus of a man locked onto a target. He believed he had the enemy running. The decoy riders were doing exactly what they wanted the soldiers to believe. They appeared again on the edge of sight, then pulled back. They stayed close enough to be insultingly visible. They rode as if saying, "Come on, try." And for soldiers who were tired of being attacked and never catching anyone, that kind of challenge could feel personal. Fetterman's men followed. Not all of them followed with the same feeling. Some likely had worry in their stomachs. Some likely remembered Carrington's strict orders. But in a moving group, doubt often stays silent. The loudest force becomes momentum, and momentum pushes people forward even when their minds whisper to slow down. The ground dipped ahead. The riders disappeared into it. Fetterman and the men behind him crested the slope and entered the low area. That was the moment the world opened like a trap. From behind rocks, from tree lines, from hidden folds in the earth, warriors rose in numbers, far greater than the soldiers had expected. They came fast. They came from several directions. They did not look surprised. They looked ready. The soldiers had been chasing a handful. Now they faced hundreds. This was not a sudden accident. It was planned. The decoy had done its job. The soldiers were where the attackers wanted them, away from the fort, out of sight, in ground that could be surrounded in later years. Some people would connect the decoy tactic to a young warrior named Crazy Horse. The full details of who did what on the field are hard to pin down with complete certainty. But what is clear is that the tactic was real and it worked. It showed discipline and coordination. It showed an understanding of the soldiers' habits and emotions. The first shots cracked through the cold. Air dot smoke flashed from rifle muzzles. Horses jerked and reared. Men shouted. The clean march of the relief force broke into scattered movement. The soldiers tried to form lines, but the land did not make it easy. A dip here separated men. A small rise there blocked sight. In seconds, the unit was no longer one shape. It became pieces. Fetterman's men fired back. They were not helpless. Many were trained. Some had good rifles. They could hit hard when they had time to aim. But the attackers were not standing still. In the open, they moved with the terrain. They rode in and out of view. They used the slopes and trees like cover. They also had the advantage of numbers, and numbers change everything. When a man is surrounded, he does not only fight what he sees, he fights what he fears is coming from behind him. The soldiers tried to pull into a stronger position. They looked for higher ground. They looked for a place where they could keep their backs protected. But every direction had danger. And the longer the fight lasted, the more certain it became that help from the fort would not arrive in time. Back at Fort Phil Kearny, men on the walls could hear distant gunfire. They could not see the battle clearly. The hills hid the truth. Carrington knew the sounds meant trouble, but he also knew sending another group blindly into the same ground could create a second disaster. This was the cruel math of the place. The fort was strong only within sight and range. Beyond the ridge, it was almost powerless. Out in the hills, the fight grew tighter. A soldier is trained to think about orders and lines. But in an ambush, the mind shifts to simpler things. Breathe, load, aim, survive. Men fired until their fingers were stiff. They bit cartridges with numb lips. They shouted warnings that the wind carried away. Some began to understand the trap fully, and that understanding brought a sick feeling. The enemy was not only attacking them, the enemy had read them. The enemy had shaped their choices. The enemy had pulled them to a place where the soldiers' strength, discipline, and formation could be broken apart. The attackers pressed closer. The circle tightened. At this stage, battles stop feeling like history and start feeling like personal minutes that never end. A man glances to the side and sees someone he spoke with that morning now on the ground. A man looks down and realizes his hands are shaking, not from fear alone, but from cold and exhaustion. A man hears shouting and cannot tell if it is his own voice. Fetterman's leadership was being tested in the worst possible way. There was no clear front. There was no clear retreat path. There were only choices, each one costly. Some soldiers tried to hold a defensive spot, firing in controlled volleys. Others moved in small groups, trying to reach better ground. But the attackers were faster across that land, and they seemed to know every fold and hiding place. And then the fight shifted again. The decoy riders were no longer decoys. They were now part of the closing force. The soldiers could see movement on multiple sides at once. The sound of hooves and shouting grew louder, closer, more confident. The winter sky above them looked pale and uncaring. The snow around them looked untouched in places where no one could reach it. It was a strange, bitter contrast, beauty and violence in the same frame. The soldiers' gunfire began to slow in some pockets. Not everywhere, but enough to change the feeling. When shots become less frequent, it often means one of two things. Men are running low, or men are falling. The attackers felt that change. They surged again. Fetterman's men were now fighting with their backs to land that offered no easy escape. The trap was not just closing. It was closing fast. And as the smoke hung low over the snow, the final question became unavoidable. Could any of them break through before the circle became a wall? Because the next moments would decide whether this was a defeat or a complete ending. The fight did not stay wide and scattered for long. In an ambush, time is a weapon. The longer the attackers controlled the field, the more the trapped force loses shape, breath, and hope. Fetterman's men were now separated into smaller groups, each trying to survive in the cold and chaos. Some soldiers fought from slight rises in the ground, others tried to hold positions near rocks or thin tree cover. A few were caught in open spots where there was nowhere to hide at all. The snow made everything worse. It slowed movement, it stole strength, it hit uneven ground that could trip a man during the 1 second he needed balance most. Every breath burned. Every reload felt slower than it should. And still, the attackers pressed in. They did not rush in a messy wave. They moved with a pattern. Riders swept in, tested the line, then pulled back. Others appeared where the soldiers least wanted them. The circle kept shifting, tightening, and tightening again. It was like watching a net close around struggling hands. The soldiers fired hard when they could. Some shots found targets. Some warriors fell. But the attackers had numbers and speed, and they used those advantages with calm control. It was not only strength, it was decision-making under pressure. This is what made the day so shocking to the men at the fort later. It was not a random clash. It was a planned trap carried out with discipline. Somewhere in the middle of the chaos, a simple truth became clear. The soldiers were not going to chase the enemy away. They were now fighting for minutes, maybe seconds of life. Fetterman's face, whatever it looked like in that moment, is not something history can show with certainty, but the situation around him tells its own story. He had led men beyond the ridge. Now he had to hold them together in terrain that favored the enemy, with the fort too far away to help in that kind of moment. Leadership becomes very small and very human. It is no longer speeches and plans. It is shouting directions that may not be heard. It is pointing to a rise. It is choosing whether to stand or move, whether to defend or push, whether to try to break out or hold a final line. The soldiers likely tried to gather toward stronger ground. A group under pressure often pulls toward a point, like iron filings toward a magnet. The hope is that being together increases survival. Together means more guns aimed outward. Together means fewer blind spots. But the attackers understood that. They attacked the edges. They hit the flanks. They made sure the soldiers could not settle into one strong formation for long. Each time the soldiers tried to shape a line, the shape broke again. Some soldiers began to run low on ammunition. Others had weapons that misfired in cold air or with shaking hands. Reloading took time, and time was exactly what the attackers wanted to steal. The sound of the fight was not one steady roar. It came in bursts. A volley here, a shout there, a sudden rush of hooves, then a moment of strange quiet, as if the land itself was deciding what would happen next. In those quiet moments, fear grows louder. A man starts to hear his own breathing too clearly. A man looks at the sky and thinks of home. A man wonders if anyone will ever know what happened to him here. This is the emotional center of the story, even if it is not written in official reports. The men were not thinking about history. They were thinking about faces, wives, children, parents. They were thinking about warmth. They were thinking about how unfair it felt to be taken so far from help. And at the same time, the warriors pressing in were not fighting for a medal or a promotion. They were fighting for a homeland that was being cut into, for a way of life that was being squeezed. Many had seen what the trail brought: more wagons, more forts, more pressure. They knew that stopping the soldiers here could save families. Later, two human worlds were colliding, and both sides believed the stakes were life itself. Back at Fort Phil Kearny, men watched the ridges with growing panic. Some could see distant movement, but the hills hid most of the truth. They could hear the gunfire fade and surge. They could not read the pattern. They could not know how many were out there or how bad it had become. Carrington faced an impossible decision. If he sent a second large force out, it could also be pulled into the same trap. If he waited, the men already out there could be lost. Every commander knows that feeling. The mind racing, the heart heavy, the sense that any choice might break lives. Inside the fort, some men likely demanded action. Others likely feared leaving. The fort itself became a room full of tension, with everyone listening to the distant sound of men dying. Out in the hills, a circle tightened again. The attackers pressed closer, close enough that the soldiers could see faces more clearly now, close enough that every movement mattered, close enough that a mistake could end everything. Some soldiers may have tried to break through a weaker spot in the surrounding force. This is a natural instinct. Find a gap, punch through, run hard, and reach the ridge again. But on that ground, with that many warriors moving fast, gaps could close like water. The soldiers might have managed short bursts of movement, only to be forced back or split again. The terrain did not offer a clean road back. It offered slopes, dips, and lines of sight that shifted every time a man moved 10 steps. The feeling of control disappeared. The soldiers were reacting now, not directing. When a force reacts long enough, exhaustion becomes the true enemy. Exhaustion slows the hands, it blurs the eyes, it makes the mind accept defeat before the body does. The warriors could sense that. They surged in closer. At some point, the fight reached a stage where the outcome was no longer a question. It was only a matter of how quickly the end would come. This is the part that turns a battle into a name remembered for generations. Not because it was large by the numbers of later wars, but because it was complete. And when battles are complete like that, people stop calling them just fights. They begin calling them warnings. In the next moments, the soldiers' gunfire would fade in one pocket after another. The groups would become smaller. The distance between survivors would shrink until there were almost none left to shrink, and the hills cold, silent, and unchanging would take back the space. Because soon, the fort would no longer hear gunfire at all. Only the wind died out in the winter hills. The fight reached the point where time stopped feeling normal. It did not move like a clock. It moved like a tightening hand. Every minute became heavier than the last. Fetterman's men were no longer one unit. They were small groups, pressed into smaller spaces, forced into quick decisions. Some tried to hold higher ground. Some tried to move toward any cover they could find. Some stayed where they were, because moving in open snow meant becoming a clear target. The attackers kept their pressure steady. They moved with the land. They used dips, ridges, and trees like doors that opened and closed. They shifted their position so the soldiers never felt safe on any side. When the soldiers aimed in one direction, movement appeared in another. When the soldiers tried to pull back, the circle moved with them. This was not only strength, it was control. The relief party's original mission had been simple: reach the wood train, push attackers away, and return. Now that mission had vanished. The only mission left was survival, and even that was slipping. The cold did not care who was brave. It made fingers stiff, it made eyes water, it made every reload slower, it made every fall more dangerous. That men had to fight the weather and the ambush at the same time, and both were winning. At some point, Fetterman must have understood a truth that came too late. The fort was not coming in time. The ridge was too far. The field was too controlled by the enemy. The battle had moved beyond rescue. No one alive today can say the exact words spoken in those final minutes. No one can describe the exact positions of every man. There were no survivors from the relief force. That is part of what makes this story so haunting. The ending is known, but the last details are hidden behind silence. Still, the shape of the end can be understood. As ammunition ran low in some pockets, the soldiers' firing slowed. In a battle like this, that change is like blood in the water. The attackers feel it. They sense weakness. They surge harder. They move closer. The fight became close enough that it no longer felt like a distant exchange of shots. It became personal. It became faces, movement, and fear in the same frame. The snow around the men was marked by hurried steps and sudden drops. Horses screamed and pulled away, riderless. Smoke drifted low and thin in the cold air, and then one group after another fell silent. It did not happen all at once. It happened like candles going out in a storm. A pocket of men fired, then stopped. Another pocket fired, then stopped. Each silence gave the attackers room to close further around the next. Groups still resisting. Fetterman's force was being erased in sections. Back at Fort Phil Kearny, the men on the walls listened. The distant gunfire had sounded sharp at first, like a fight that might still be won. But then it began to fade. Not because the battle had ended, but because the soldiers were being pushed into positions the fort could not see. The hills were swallowing the sound. Colonel Carrington faced a terrible problem. He could not see the full situation. He could not know whether the relief party was winning, losing, or already gone. If he sent a large rescue force into the same ground, it could also be pulled into the trap. The fort could lose even more men in minutes. Carrington chose caution, but caution did not feel like safety. It felt like helplessness. Inside the fort, anger and fear mixed. Some men likely demanded that the gates open and everyone ride out. Others likely begged to stay behind the walls. In a place like that, every soldier carried two fights: the fight outside and the fight inside his own mind. Time passed in slow, painful pieces. Then the gunfire stopped. The silence was worse than the shots. In that silence, imagination becomes cruel. Men picture the worst because the worst is the only thing that fits the sudden quiet. Carrington waited for signs. He waited for movement on the ridge. He waited for any figure returning. He waited for a messenger. Nothing came. The sun moved across the pale winter sky. The air grew colder. Shadows lengthened on the snow, and the fort remained a hard wooden box filled with dread. When the time finally came to search, it could not be done with the same hope that sends men out in the morning. It had to be done with care and fear. A recovery party could not rush. The attackers might still be nearby. The hills might still be full of watchers. The men who went out likely moved in a tight group, scanning ridges, expecting another trap. Every tree line looked like danger. Every dip in the ground looked like a hiding place. The land itself had become untrustworthy. As they approached the area of the fight, they began to find signs first: a dropped piece of gear, a broken line of footprints, a scattered weapon, a dark stain on snow that did not belong to winter. Then they found bodies. The exact scene is not something that needs heavy detail to be understood. The meaning was clear the moment it was seen. The relief force had been destroyed. Every man sent out under Fetterman's command was dead. The count came to about 80-1. There were no wounded men asking for water. No survivors sitting against a rock. No last message to carry back. Only loss. For the soldiers at the fort, this was more than defeat. It was a shock that broke their sense of order. Armies are built on the belief that plans can reduce chaos. This battle proved that the land and the enemy could still create chaos that plans could not stop. For the Lakota and their allies, the victory was powerful, and it carried a message. It showed that the forts and the trail could be challenged. It showed that careful tactics, patience, and unity could defeat soldiers, even when the soldiers had rifles and training. The Lakota name for the battle captured the weight of it. The Battle of the 100 Slain, often remembered in English as the Battle of 100 Indo-Hands. The name did not come from exaggeration. It came from impact. It was a way to mark the scale of the victory and the finality of the outcome. After the bodies were recovered, Fort Phil Kearny did not become safer. It became heavier. Every man who stood watch that night knew what could happen beyond the ridge. Every wood train run would carry a new kind of fear. Every officer would feel the shadow of that day when giving orders. And in the quiet after the storm, one question hung in the cold air like breath. How could a small group be pulled so perfectly into a trap? Because the answer to that question would shape what came next, not only for the fort, but for the entire war. After the battle, Fort Phil Kearny did not celebrate anything. It did not feel like a fort that had survived. It felt like a fort that had been warned. The men inside moved differently. They spoke differently. Even small sounds, boots on wood, a door closing, seemed sharper in the silence that followed. The loss of the relief party was not a rumor. It was a fact that had been carried back on the snow. And with that fact came something else. Blame. In every tragedy, people look for a single reason, a single mistake, a single person to hold responsible. It is a human way of trying to control pain. If the disaster can be explained neatly, then it feels like it could have been prevented neatly. But this battle did not allow a neat explanation. Still, the arguments began. Some men blamed Captain Fetterman for pushing too far and crossing the ridge. They said he ignored the clear limits set by Carrington. They said pride and impatience pulled him into danger. Others blamed Colonel Carrington. They said he was too cautious, too slow, too unwilling to support the men once the fight began. They said his leadership style created frustration that led to reckless decisions. They said he should have gone out with more men or with a different plan. There were also men who blamed the land itself, the hills, the distance, the weather, the fact that Fort Phil Kearny was built in a place where the enemy controlled every ridgeline and every hidden dip, but the land could not be punished, and winter could not be argued with. So the blame continued to circle back to human choices. Carrington faced the hardest kind of pressure, criticism from people who were not out there in that moment, and grief from the families who would never get their sons or husbands back. He had to keep the fort alive while the world judged him. In a way, Carrington was too trapped inside the responsibility of command. While soldiers argued inside the fort, the warriors outside had their own understanding of what had happened. For the Lakota and their allies, this was not luck. It was the result of planning. They had watched the fort's routines. They had learned the wood train's weaknesses. They had used the decoy tactic to pull soldiers into ground chosen in advance. They had proven they could control the shape of a battle. That victory sent a message. And the message traveled faster than any wagon. It told every traveler on the Bozeman Trail that the trail was not safe. It told every soldier that the forts were not untouchable. It told Red Cloud's people that the forts could be pressured until they became too costly to hold. And Red Cloud's strategy depended on exactly that. He did not need to destroy every fort in one day. He needed to make them bleed, again and again, until the cost became unacceptable. The Fetterman Fight was a moment where that strategy became undeniable. At Fort Phil Kearny, daily life had to continue, because survival required routine. Wood was still needed. Guards still had to stand watch. But everything was tighter now. Every movement outside the walls was treated as a serious risk. Officers adjusted their plans. Some became more cautious. Others became more determined. A few likely became quietly afraid. Fear does not always show itself in panic. Sometimes it shows itself in careful eyes and shorter conversations. The soldiers also began to understand something they had not fully accepted before. They were not fighting an enemy that acted randomly. They were fighting an enemy that could plan like an army, move like an army, and choose the rules of engagement. That realization matters. It changes how people think. It changes how they move. It changes how they respect the opponent. In the months and years that followed, the conflict did not disappear. Fort Phil Kearny and the other forts along the Bozeman Trail remained the targets. Attacks continued. Pressure continued. The war continued to grind against the fort like stone against wood. But the Fetterman Fight stood out as a turning point. It was a defeat that could not be explained away as a small mistake or a bad day. It was too complete, too final, too loud in its message. Outside the fort, Red Cloud's cause grew stronger. Warriors from different groups could see proof that the soldiers could be beaten. They could see that unity and careful tactics could create victory against rifles and walls. That kind of proof builds confidence, and confidence builds commitment. For the U.S. side, the battle forced officials to look at the Bozeman Trail and the forts with new eyes. The road was not just a route, it was a contested line. Holding it required constant risk, constant supplies, constant men. It required a cost that kept rising, and costs eventually create decisions. The war moved toward a point where negotiation became more likely, not because anyone suddenly became kind, but because the pressure made continued fighting expensive and uncertain. Years later, this would lead to a major outcome. The U.S. would agree to abandon the forts along the Bozeman Trail as part of a treaty process in 1868 that did not solve every problem, and it did not create permanent peace. But it was a major result, and it was connected to the reality proven by battles like this one. The Fetterman Fight also became a story that people used in different ways. Some used it as a warning about pride. Some used it as a lesson about terrain and tactics. Some used it as proof of native strength and planning. Some used it to argue about leadership, blaming Carrington or praising him, blaming Fetterman or excusing him, and many used it simply as a dark tale. 81 men leaving a fort and never coming back. But the most important lesson was not only military, it was human. It showed what happens when people stop listening to limits. It showed what happens when frustration turns into risk. It showed what happens when one side believes the other side is simple or weak. Because on that winter day, the soldiers did not meet chaos. They met a strategy. The Fetterman Fight did not stand alone. It was a single day inside a larger struggle. A struggle that had been building long before the first shot near Fort Phil Kearny. That larger struggle was known as Red Cloud's War. Red Cloud was not fighting for attention. He was fighting for a clear goal, to stop travel on the Bozeman Trail and remove the forts built to protect it. In his view, those forts were not defense. They were tools meant to claim land that was already lived on and depended on. The land around the trail was not just scenery. It was a lifeline. It fed people. It held sacred meaning. It connected families and seasons. When the trail brought more wagons and more soldiers, it also brought less space, less game, and more pressure. So Red Cloud's War was built on a hard truth. If the forts stayed, more would follow. If the trail stayed open, the future would be squeezed tighter each year. This is why Red Cloud's strategy was not simply to attack in anger. It was to apply pressure in a way that made the trail unusable. The Fetterman Fight was one of the clearest examples of that. Pressure working. After the battle, word spread along the Bozeman Trail. Travelers heard that a large relief force had been wiped out near the fort. They heard that the hills were full of warriors. They heard that even trained soldiers could be pulled into a trap and destroyed. A trail survives on confidence. People use it when they believe they can get through. When confidence dies, traffic slows. When traffic slows, the reason for the forts weakens. That is exactly what Red Cloud needed. The U.S. Army could keep men inside forts for a time. It could keep sending supplies. It could build stronger walls. But it could not easily change the basic problem. The forts were sitting in hostile territory, surrounded by high ground and open ranges, controlled by people who knew the land better than any soldier ever could. And those people were not fighting alone. The Lakota were joined at times by Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. That shared effort mattered. It expanded strength. It expanded knowledge. It expanded the ability to watch and strike. At Fort Phil Kearny, the soldiers tried to adapt. After a defeat like the Fetterman Fight, no commander could pretend the threat was small. Patrols became more careful. With train escorts became larger. Rules became stricter. But strict rules do not solve a problem if the problem is constant. The fort needed wood every day. Every wood trip still had to go out into open country. The soldiers still had to cross spaces where they could be watched and tested. And the attackers still had the advantage of choosing when to strike. This is how wars like this grind people down. It is not only the big battles. It is the stress between them. It is the fear that returns every morning. It is the question that sits in a man's mind before he steps outside the walls. Will I come back? For the native side, victory did not mean life became easy. War is never easy. It brings loss. It brings pain. But a victory like the Battle of the 100 Slain did something powerful. It proved that resistance could succeed. It proved that the forts could be pressured. It proved that planning and patience could defeat speed and weapons. And it gave weight to Red Cloud's message. The Bozeman Trail would not be accepted quietly. Over time, that pressure created a shift. U.S. leaders could see that keeping the trail open through force was not a simple task. Every mile required men. Every fort required supplies. Every supply wagon required protection. The cost, in money and lives, kept rising. There is a point in every conflict where leaders begin to ask, what are we gaining and what are we losing? In this war, the question grew louder after battles like the Fetterman Fight. The loss of 81 men in one day was not something that could be ignored. It did not guarantee peace, but it forced attention. It made the Bozeman Trail look less like a normal route and more like a dangerous gamble. This is how the war moved toward negotiation. In 1868, after years of conflict, the United States and Lakota leaders met to form what became known as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The agreement included a major step. The U.S. would abandon the contested forts along the Bozeman Trail, including Fort Phil Kearny. That outcome was not just paperwork. It was a result of pressure. It was the war's message becoming policy, at least for a time. For Red Cloud, it was a rare kind of victory. He had fought to close a road and remove forts, and that goal was achieved. In the history of the Plains Wars, that stands out. It is important to say something clearly here. This treaty did not end all conflict. Later years brought new tensions, broken promises, and new wars. The pain did not disappear. But in the frame of Red Cloud's war, the result was significant, and the Fetterman Fight helped shape it. The battle also shaped memory. To many Americans, the name Fetterman Fight became a warning about what happens when a force chases too far and loses support. It became a lesson taught in military thinking about terrain, scouting, and not underestimating an opponent. To the Lakota and their allies, the battle name carried honor and proof. The Battle of the 100 Slain marked a moment when strategy and unity brought a complete victory. It became part of oral history, part of identity, part of the memory of defending a homeland. Two names for one event, two memories living side by side, and that is where the deeper truth sits. History is not only what happened, history is also what it meant to the people who lived it. The Fetterman Fight is often told as a single, dramatic ambush. But when it is placed inside Red Cloud's war, it becomes more than a battlefield story. It becomes a chapter in a larger biography of resistance, pressure, and survival. After a battle like this, the fighting stops, but the story does not. The story begins to grow. It spreads from mouth to mouth, from report to report, from memory to memory. And as it spreads, people shape it. That is what happened after the Fetterman Fight. At Fort Phil Kearny, grief turned into routine, because routine was the only way the fort could keep functioning. Guards still stood watch. Wood still had to be gathered. Orders still had to be given. But everything felt heavier, as if the fort itself was carrying a weight it could not put down. The men who survived inside the walls were haunted by one simple fact. They had listened to the gunfire, and then they had listened to silence. It is hard to live with that. Some soldiers felt anger toward the enemy. Some felt anger toward their own commanders. Some felt anger toward themselves for not being out there, even though being out there might have meant dying too. In a small fort, emotions do not have room to hide. They sit in the air like smoke. And then came the arguments. When there are no survivors from the main group, the truth becomes fragile. People fill gaps with assumptions. They build explanations that match what they already believe. That is how controversy grows. Many blamed Captain Fetterman. They said he crossed Lodge Trail Ridge and ignored Carrington's order. They said he let the chase pull him into a trap. They said he wanted a victory so badly that he stopped thinking about safety. Others defended him. They said he was responding to a serious attack. They said the situation outside the fort forced fast choices. They said his mission was unclear, or that the pressure of constant attacks made every officer desperate for a decisive action at the same time. Colonel Carrington became a target of criticism. Some people said Carrington should never have allowed the relief force to be placed in that position. They said he should have had stronger patrols, better scouting, or different leadership. They said his caution created frustration that led to reckless decisions. Others argued Carrington was right to be cautious. They said he knew the land was dangerous. They said he gave clear orders about the ridge. They said sending another rescue force into the same trap would have created an even larger disaster. This debate did not stay inside the fort. It traveled outward into newspapers, military circles, and public conversation. People who were not there began to speak as if they had been. That is another way legends form. Distance makes voices louder. Even the names of the battle shape the story. Fetterman Fight focuses on a U.S. officer and the tragedy of the lost command. It makes the event feel like a cautionary tale about leadership and military decisions. Battle of the 100 Slain, or 100 in the Hands, focuses on the scale of the victory and the strength of the warriors who achieved it. It honors the result and marks it as a turning point. The same event, remembered from different sides, becomes two different meanings. And then there is the question that always appears in famous battles. Who was the mastermind? Over the years, many stories placed Crazy Horse at the center of the decoy tactic, describing him as a key figure who lured the soldiers forward. Crazy Horse later became one of the most famous leaders associated with Plains resistance, so his name naturally attached itself to dramatic moments. But history is complicated. Battles involve many people. Plans are carried out by groups, not by one person alone. It is possible that Crazy Horse played a major role in the decoy. It is also possible that later storytelling made his role sound larger than what can be proven in detail today. What can be said with confidence is this: the tactic was real. The decoy was effective. The planning was strong. And the warriors on that field showed discipline and coordination that the soldiers did not expect. That is part of why the defeat hit so hard. The U.S. Army did not just lose men. It lost certainty. It lost the belief that technology and training automatically guaranteed control. It lost the idea that the enemy was simple, disorganized, or easy to intimidate. That kind of lesson changes how an institution behaves. It changes strategy, rules, and caution levels. It also changes public opinion, because the public often expects the army to be unstoppable. When the army is stopped, people demand explanations. Fort Phil Kearny remained in place for a time, but the meaning of the fort shifted. It no longer felt like a symbol of strength. It felt like a symbol of being surrounded. Every wagon that arrived seemed lucky. Every wood detail felt like walking into a test dot in native communities. The memory of the victory held a different power. It was proof that the Bozeman Trail could be challenged. It was proof that unity could work. It was proof that the forts were not invincible. Victories like this do something important in war. They create confidence. They tell young warriors that resistance is possible. They tell leaders that their strategy has teeth. They tell families that the fight is not hopeless. In that way, the battle became more than a single day. It became a message carried forward. Still, even victories carry sorrow. War always does. Behind every battle name are lives that ended and families that changed forever. The difference is how each side describes the meaning of those losses. For the soldiers' families, the story became a wound. Many would never know the exact final moments. Many would only hear none survived, which is both simple and unbearable. Grief without detail can feel like grief without closure. For the fort itself, the battle became a permanent memory. Men who served there afterward walked in the shadow of that day. They learned the ridgeline's name the way people learn the name of a dangerous storm. And for the American West, the story hardened into legend, because the West is full of stories where a small mistake becomes a fatal choice, where a landscape becomes a character, where pride and fear collide in a place with no mercy. The Fetterman Fight fit that pattern, but it also challenged the usual myths. It showed native forces not as background figures, but as strategic actors. It showed planning, patience, and control. It showed leadership that could outthink a trained enemy. That is why this battle is still discussed, not only because it was tragic, not only because it was dramatic, but because it exposed how fragile certainty can be. By now, the story has moved beyond the gunfire and into the deeper question of meaning. What did this battle change? What did it teach? What did it cost? As the weeks passed after the Fetterman Fight, Fort Phil Kearny remained standing, but it no longer felt steady. The walls were still made of wood, but now the fear felt like a second wall, thicker, heavier, and harder to ignore. The soldiers understood something clearly now. The fort could not protect them everywhere. It could only protect them when they stayed close enough for support. Beyond the ridge, beyond the sight lines, the land belonged to those who knew it best. That change in understanding shaped everything. Wood trips became more guarded. Patrols became more careful. Orders became stricter. The fort moved like a man walking on ice, slowly, watching every step, afraid of the crack that could open at any moment. But careful steps did not remove the problem. The fort still needed wood. The trail still pulled wagons through contested land. The conflict still had no easy end. On the native side, the victory carried energy. It was not only a story to repeat, it was proof that the strategy was working. Red Cloud's war was built on pressure, and pressure creates results when it is steady. The Bozeman Trail was valuable to travelers because it was faster than other routes, but speed means nothing if the route is deadly. Every new story of attack made wagon teams hesitate. Every rumor of ambush made men choose longer, safer roads. The trail began to feel less like opportunity and more like a gamble, and the forts built to secure the trail began to look less like protection and more like bait. It is important to understand what the U.S. Army was trying to do. It was trying to place fixed points, forts into a wide landscape, then use those points to control movement. This works when supply lines are stable and threats are manageable. But at Fort Phil Kearny, supply lines were fragile and threats were constant. The terrain gave attackers the advantage. The warriors did not need to defeat the fort itself every day. They only needed to keep striking its weak points with trains, scouting parties, wagons. That kind of war does not end with one dramatic victory. It ends with exhaustion. After the Fetterman Fight, the cost of holding the trail looked even higher. Officials had to consider the value of the road compared to the risk. Soldiers had to consider the mission compared to their survival. Every loss sharpened the question, and the question slowly changed from how do we win to why are we here? This is the part of the story where battles create consequences beyond the battlefield. A single ambush can change politics. A single defeat can change policy. Not instantly, but gradually. Like water wearing down stone. Red Cloud's strategy was built for that kind of effect. He did not need to conquer a city. He needed to break the confidence that kept wagons moving and forts supplied. He needed to show that the land could not be controlled from behind wooden walls. The Fetterman Fight did exactly that. It was the clearest message possible. If soldiers chased, they could be pulled into death. If soldiers left the fort, they could be erased. The enemy was not weak. The enemy could plan. That message did not stay in Wyoming territory. It traveled to commanders, politicians, newspapers, and families. It became part of how the public understood the conflict. When a country feels surprise, it demands answers. When it feels uncertain, it begins to consider negotiation. In the years that followed, negotiations took shape. By 1868, the conflict reached a point where U.S. leadership agreed to major terms that included abandoning the contested forts along the Bozeman Trail. Fort Phil Kearny would be left behind, not captured in a heroic final assault, but given up because holding it was too costly and too uncertain. this outcome mattered. It was not just a military decision. It was a rare moment in plains warfare where native resistance achieved a clear strategic goal. Red Cloud had fought to close the trail. He had fought to remove the forts. And for that moment in time, those goals were met. This does not mean everything became peaceful afterward. It did not. The West continued to change. Pressure returned in new forms. Later years would bring new conflicts and broken promises. But within the frame of Red Cloud's war, the result was real. It was a decision shaped by what battles, like the Fetterman Fight, had proven. The fort's abandonment also changed how people remembered the battle. When a fort is built, people often assume it will remain like a permanent statement. When it is abandoned, people begin asking what it meant in the first place. To some Americans, the story became a warning about overconfidence. The lesson was simple. Do not chase into unknown ground. Do not underestimate the opponent. And do not break the rules meant to keep you alive. Too many native communities. The story remained proof of strategy and unity. It was a memory of standing up against a powerful force and winning on chosen ground through planning and courage. That difference in memory is not an accident. It is how human history works. People do not only remember what happened, they remember what they believe it proves. And here, two names still show the two meanings. Fetterman Fight focuses on a defeat and a decision that ended badly. Battle of the 100 Slain focuses on a victory and a message delivered clearly. Both names hold truth. They simply hold different truths. Long after the gunfire stopped, the land remained. The hills near Fort Phil Kearny did not change their shape for anyone. Snow still fell. Wind still moved through the pines. The ridgeline still cut the sky the way it did on December 21st, 1866. But people changed. The Fetterman Fight also, remembered as the Battle of the 100 Slain. The Battle of 100 in the hands left marks that could not be seen on the ground alone. It changed how men thought about war on the plains. It changed how leaders spoke about the Bozeman Trail. It changed how communities remembered what it meant to resist, to obey, to lead, and to survive. In the simplest terms, the battle became a story about a line that should not have been crossed. Lodge Trail Ridge was not magical. It was not cursed. It was simply a piece of terrain that carried a clear military meaning. On one side of it, Fort Phil Kearny could support a force. On the other side, a force became isolated. Carrington's order to stay on the fort's side of that ridge was not a random rule. It was a safety rule. It was a rule shaped by the land and the reality of the enemy's strength. But the human heart does not always follow rules, especially when pride has been bruised. That is why this story still matters, because what happened was not only about weapons, it was about emotions. The soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny had been attacked again and again while cutting wood. They were frustrated. They felt mocked. They wanted a moment where they could strike back and feel in control. Many believed bold action would solve the problem. The decoy riders used that emotion like a tool. They did not need to break the fort's walls. They only needed to pull men far enough away that the walls could not help. They needed to make the soldiers believe that chasing was the same as winning. And when the soldiers followed, the trap became a battlefield. This is the lesson that makes the battle feel modern. Even though it happened in 1866, people can be guided by what they want to believe. When a person wants a simple victory, they may ignore a hard warning. When a person wants to prove a point, they may step into risk with open eyes. When a group is tired and angry, they may mistake danger for courage. The Fetterman Fight shows how quickly that can turn fatal. But the story is also about something else, something that many older Western stories did not always admit clearly. It is about native strategy and leadership. For many years, popular stories about the American West were told in a way that made native people seem like background figures, like a force that appeared and disappeared without plan. This battle contradicts that idea completely. The Battle of the 100 Slain was not chaos. It was planning. It was coordination. It was understanding of terrain, timing, and the enemy's behavior. It showed that the Lakota and their allies were not only fighters, they were strategists defending a homeland. And that defense was connected to Red Cloud's larger goal: close the Bozeman Trail and remove the forts. In the end, that goal was achieved for a time. The forts along the trail, including Fort Phil Kearny, were abandoned after the conflict moved toward negotiation in 1868. That outcome does not erase later tragedies or later broken promises. It does not erase the continued conflicts that came afterward, but it does show that Native resistance could shape outcomes in real, measurable ways. It was not symbolic, it was strategic. So what is the final meaning of this story? It depends on where a person stands. To one side, it is the Fetterman Fight, a warning about pride, disobedience, and underestimating an opponent. To the other side, it is the battle of 100 and no hands, a proof of planning, unity, and the power of defending home. But both sides share one truth. It was a turning point that could not be ignored, and perhaps that is why it still feels alive today, because it is not only about the past, it is about human decisions that repeat across time. A leader must decide when to push and when to stop. A group must decide whether anger is guiding them. A community must decide what it is willing to lose to hold what it believes is right. That is what makes this a biography, not just of one man, but of a moment of a ridgeline, a chase, a trap, and the silence that followed. Music lifts slightly, calm and resolved. In the end, the snow melted. Seasons changed. The fort was left behind, but the names remained. Fetterman Fight, Battle of the 100, Slain, 100 dash, in dash, the dash hands. Different words for the same day, different meanings for the same outcome. A reminder that history is not only what happened, it is also what people carry forward. And if this story pulled you in, there are more like it: real, human, and unforgettable. If you want more true, story-driven biographies from the Wild West, told in simple, clear English, subscribe to the channel. And comment the word ridge if you believe the biggest force that day was not bullets, but the decision to cross a line that should have held. Next time, the story continues with another turning point of the Plains Wars where a single moment changes everything again.